The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 lasted 52 days before it had to be put down by federal troops and the National Guard, but only after the fighting had resulted in over 100 deaths and workers having burned several railroad cars and engines. Another big railroad strike occurred in 1886, involving more than 200,000 labor union workers. On May 4, 1886, a gathering at Haymarket Square in Chicago to protest police brutality against striking workers turned into a riot when someone threw a bomb at police officers trying to disperse the crowd. In the ensuing chaos, 7 police officers and 1 protester died. Searching for those responsible, police in Chicago and elsewhere rounded up radicals, labor organizers, and anti-capitalists, selecting 8 men who were tried and convicted for the events at Haymarket Square. Though some found the trial's evidence to be weak and saw the convicted men, most of whom were given the death sentence, as martyrs, for many others the takeaway from this event was heightened anti-labor sentiment. Nevertheless, efforts to improve labor rights continued. In the Pullman Strike of 1894, widespread striking and boycotting severely disrupted rail traffic in the Midwest. The strike occurred in response to pay cuts that the Pullman Palace Railroad Car Company made to its workers' already low wages. The company did not, however, correspondingly reduce rents and other costs in its company's town of Pullman, Illinois, near Chicago, where the majority of its workers lived in company housing. Workers and their families were starving, but the company's president refused to make any changes and ordered those that complained to be fired. The workers decided to strike. Some of the workers belonged to the American Railway Union, and union delegates found a way to support the strike. ARU members across the country would boycott the Pullman Company, refusing to hitch Pullman-made cars to trains and unhitching any Pullman cars already attached. The strategy, masterminded by ARU president and future U.S. presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs, soon had 125,000 workers on 29 railroads quitting work rather than handle Pullman cars. Some estimates say the number was closer to 250,000 workers across 27 states. Though the strike was successfully holding up trains, workers were still angry, and in addition, they set fire to engines and engaged in various riots. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to Chicago to quell the violence and obtain the court injunction, which said the ARU could no longer communicate with any of its members nor do anything to stop its members from working. Violence erupted between the striking workers and the federal troops, culminating July 6, 1874, when more than 6,000 rioters destroyed hundreds of rail cars in the South Chicago Panhandle yards. The strike only finally came to an end when the railroad started hiring non-union workers to replace those it lost. The trains started moving again. The ordeal had cost the railroads millions of dollars in lost revenue and destroyed property, and the strikers had lost more than $1 million in wages. The Pullman Company was forced to divest its company town, which became part of Chicago, after the federal government conducted an inquiry and called the company's actions in the town un-American. In the aftermath of the strike, in an effort to placate still angry workers, the Cleveland administration designated the first Monday in September as Labor Day. But public sentiment had been stirred against the strikers, who were largely immigrant workers. The influx of immigrant workers took advantage of the growing number of industrial jobs available in cities. But these jobs tended to be exploitative and low-paying as well, even as the country's GDP became the greatest in the world. Wealthy Gilded Age moguls, such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan, were known for their philanthropy. But their critics also labeled them robber barons for building their empires on the backs of an exploited working class, using tactics like intimidation, union busting, fraud, and monopolies to gain an edge on their competition. Muckrakers, or journalists who exposed corruption among the elite, helped draw public attention to these issues. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, his famous account of the grisly, dangerous, and unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry, which resulted in public outcry and legislation. Ida Tarbell wrote a 19-part series for McClure magazine in 1902 about Rockefeller. resulting in his Standard Oil company being broken up for being a monopoly. Meanwhile, as the rich got richer, the cities were filling with tenements and slums as their populations grew. Another muckraker, the photographer Jacob Riis, became famous in 1890 when he published a book called How the Other Half Lives, depicting his photographs of New York City slums, which prompted city officials to try to improve the conditions there. When the Great Blizzard of 1888 dropped between 40 to 50 inches of snow on the New York area, more than 200 people died in New York City alone, most found buried in snowdrifts along city sidewalks. But in contrast to the extreme poverty, technological marvels like new bridges, trolley lines, subways, elevators, and skyscrapers were bringing the cities into the industrial age. Thomas Edison invented a long-lasting light bulb in 1879, and the Pearl Street Power Station was bringing electric light to a small number of customers in New York City. By the light of the electric light bulb, people read newspaper accounts of the Kentucky meat shower, a mysterious event that occurred March 6, 1876. Residents of Olympia Springs, Kentucky were shocked to find large chunks of meat falling from the sky, which was never fully explained despite attempts to investigate it, though the favored local explanation was that it was vulture vomit. Construction on the Brooklyn Bridge, which connects the city's boroughs of Manhattan and Brooklyn over the East River, began in 1869. When it opened in 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It was an architectural and engineering accomplishment masterminded by John Augustus Roebling, who had developed his own method for weaving wire cables. After an on-site accident killed him at the beginning of the project, his son, Washington Roebling, took over management of the project. At least 20 workers were killed during construction, and many more were used to construct the foundations of the bridge towers. Workers toiled inside the caissons underwater at nearly double the normal atmospheric pressure, and when they returned to the surface, had symptoms of what was then called caisson disease, but today would be known as the bends. When decompression occurs too quickly, bubbles of nitrogen form in the bloodstream and can result in sharp pains, slurred speech, muscular paralysis, vomiting, and cramps. Washington Roebling, too, suffered from the caisson sickness and became bedridden, though his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, stepped in to serve as a liaison between her husband and the construction team. When the bridge was finished, she was the first person to cross it by carriage, carrying a rooster as a symbol of victory. The Gilded Age was a time of enormous economic swings, with the United States experiencing unprecedented economic growth, but also marred by economic downturns that sent prices crashing. In what became known as the Panic of 1893, problems with international investments, including failed land speculation in South Africa and Australia, and a railroad bubble caused by the railroads overbuilding and vastly outpacing demand, led people to make a run on banks, withdrawing their money. A series of banks failed, and many companies went bankrupt, including the Northern Pacific and Union Pacific Railways. This led to a huge spike in unemployment. Many people also lost their life savings in the bank collapses. Numerous farms had to cease operations, and stock prices declined. People faced starvation, turning to any work they could find to help feed their families. President Grover Cleveland was blamed for the crisis, and his administration had taken heat for the way it put down the Pullman strikes. So his Democratic Party suffered big losses during the elections of 1894. In the next presidential election in 1896, the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan was backed by the Populist People's Party, but he failed to beat the Republican candidate William McKinley. By the end of the Gilded Age, many people had become fed up with extreme wealth inequality, abusive tycoons, and widespread poverty, and were ready to usher in a new era of reform when, after McKinley was assassinated, President Theodore Roosevelt took office in 1901. By the end of the 19th century, the United States seemed to have achieved its manifest destiny. The country now stretched from one ocean to the other. It had survived a horrific and bloody civil war and stood on the precipice of a new century. Now, looking to expand its political, social, and economic resources outside of the North American continent, the United States began to extend its influence on neighboring islands and territories.